So tell us why the secretarial order was issued.
Okay, well, the secretarial order was issued because in 2003, then Secretary of Interior Gail Norton and then Governor of Utah Mike Leavitt had entered into a surprise deal that they had agreed to behind closed doors. And that deal attempted to strip BLM of its authority to protect wilderness quality lands in Utah and throughout the West. And so it would have locked us into all of the bad mistakes that BLM had made over the years, overlooking areas that were really stunning and worthy of wilderness protection, but where the BLM just thought on its own that coal development or oil and gas drilling was a better use. So Secretary Salazar's order restores wilderness as a high priority, in his words, for the BLM, and gave wilderness quality landscapes a path forward, first with protection by the BLM and then ultimately permanent protection via congressional legislation. So for about 2.6 million acres in Utah that were the subject of recent land use plans during the Bush administration. All of those lands that were largely ignored during the land use planning are now going to have the opportunity for wilderness designation, as well as additional lands in the West Desert and in some other places where the BLM hasn't conducted recent land use planning.
People opposed to wilderness preservation are saying that this secretarial order overturns the 2003 agreement between the state of Utah and the U.S. Department of Interior that prevents designation of new wilderness study areas by the Bureau of Land Management. Is this true?
Well, the Secretary certainly was critical of the order, and the order itself was a real aberration. It broke with a long history of designating new wilderness study areas in places that deserved it, and it was not in keeping with the federal statute that tells the BLM that where it's appropriate, the BLM should manage lands in their natural state, wilderness. So the agreement itself was not consistent with existing law. On the other hand, Secretary Salazar did not go back to the status quo as it existed before 2003 because the order does not specifically provide for the designation of new wilderness study areas. Now, those areas, once designated, were managed so that the wilderness character would not be impaired. It was a pretty high standard and one that was pretty effective at protecting places. There were some exceptions, but largely it was pretty effective. Now there's a new category that BLM will use. The category is called wild lands. When the BLM now, through a land use plan, identifies areas as having wilderness character, those lands will then be designated as wild lands, unless the BLM decides not to. And that's the real kicker here, because the BLM is very good and very experienced at coming up with reasons that development is more important or appropriate than wilderness. I mean, this order is sort of like a New Year's resolution that says, I'm going to get more exercise this year unless I decide not to. Well, we all know what happens there. And it's the same thing. We're all going to have to watch BLM very, very closely to make sure that they implement the spirit of the new policy.
So along those same lines, what specifically do we need to watch for as the secretarial order is implemented?
Right. Well, there are two things coming up on the horizon. One is that within 60 days of the order, which was issued on December 23rd, the BLM is supposed to come up with new guidance that will tell the state offices and the field office managers how they're supposed to implement the order. And unless they carefully define the circumstances under which BLM can find that that development is more appropriate than wilderness, the BLM, I'm afraid, is going to find go out of its way to find reasons not to protect wilderness. So we're going to be watching that very carefully and communicating with the BLM about the importance of narrowly defining those circumstances. The other thing that's coming up is that within 6 months, the BLM is going to give a plan to the Secretary that will address how wilderness is going to be considered and protected in places that have recent land use plans. And in Utah, that includes about half, the eastern half of the state, about 11 million acres. that have new land use plans issued by the Bush administration in the very last weeks. And these were very heavily focused on oil and gas development. Wilderness was really shuttled to the side. In fact, they were all done with the 2003 Wilderness Agreement between Norton and Leavitt in mind. So this summer we're going to see a plan by which the BLM is going to figure out how to deal with those existing land use plans, because the policy on its face is prospective only. It doesn't take a look backwards at mistakes that were made. So how is the BLM going to fix those mistakes in the RMP? We're going to have to wait until the summer to find out.
Finally, what can people concerned about protecting Utah's wildlands do to help ensure that they get the protection they need?
Right. Well, they need to communicate with the BLM, for one thing. They need to be talking and writing letters to the BLM about the places that they know and why they ought to be protected. To be communicating with Secretary Salazar and with the BLM Director in Washington, Bob Abbey, to explain to them why it's so important that they carefully define the circumstances under which BLM can decide not to protect wilderness and to promote development instead. Also, we're going to see a lot of action in Congress this session. Utah Congressman Rob Bishop has already come out vociferously against this new policy, and so he's going to be conducting hearings and issuing subpoenas, and so anything that people can do to communicate with their congressional representatives about why the policy is a step in the right direction and in fact needs to go further would also be helpful.